Mike Maples.
It takes just as much work to do something mediocre as to do something legendary.
For those of you in Silicon Valley, needs no introduction.
I started to create a database of startups where you would have made more than 100x on your first check. So I would study these companies. And so what I realized is, when I first saw the Cybertruck disaster demo, at first I thought maybe this is a joke. But I'll tell you one thing, nobody after seeing the Cybertruck says, how does that compare to an F-150? Startups lose if they can be compared to other things.
AI, is it a real inflection point? Is it not really an inflection point?
I think it's even more than an inflection. I think it's a sea change.
There's been a vibe shift in Silicon Valley when it comes to politics and free speech. How do you see the current moment in time?
A lot of our listeners are founders or people who want to be founders. What advice do you have for them?
It's counterintuitive, but the best way to come up with a great startup insight is not to try to think of a startup.
Hello, everyone. We are back. And since we've been away for a while, we wanted to come back with a special episode and a special guest. And that's what we have today. We have Mike Maples, founder of Floodgate Ventures and an iconic investor in companies such as Lyft and Twitch, and someone who's just on the top of Silicon Valley for a very, very, very long time. Is also one of the most thoughtful people I know around how to invest and how to think about companies. He's also a dear friend. We serve on a board together, we have investments together, and I talk to him all the time. In this conversation, we talk about a lot. We talk about his new book, Pattern Breakers, where he talks about what he finds common in some of the most iconic companies and founders. And Mike's secret, super special superpower, if you will, is his ability to see patterns across many disparate data points. And he has many across companies and founders that you may not expect. We talk about how companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and a lot of stuff with happening in AI fit and also don't fit into some of Mike's frameworks, and also how the Cybertruck plays a role, if you will. And finally, two things. One, it is August 2024. So we talk about the vibe shift around politics and tech and how there's a lot more vocal conversation around issues that never used to happen in the past. To wrap things up, Mike mentors a lot of fund managers and first-time VCs, and he has some good advice for those of you who are out there trying to raise your first fund. Is an OG. I've learned a lot from him, and he's a dear friend. We had a blast doing this episode, and I know you'll enjoy listening to it.
We have Mike Maples, who really, I think, for those of you in Silicon Valley, needs no introduction for his work as a investor, thought leader ever since I got to Silicon Valley. You've been around for a very, very long time, Mike. And over the last few years, I would say I've also gotten to work with Mike, and we share a board together and investing together. So I got to get up, see him in various different capacities, and I'll think of him as a friend. And he has this amazing new book out. It's called Pattern Breakers, Why Some Startups Change the Future. It's a blast. I highly recommend it. It's a distilled, concentrated form of Mike you can inject into your veins and mainline him, which is maybe a good place to start, Mike. I know you've been thinking about this stuff for a while, and I've seen you talk about it in various different kinds of forums. But why a book?
Yeah, so good question. So I never thought I would write one. And I guess what happened was it's one of these accidental things. About 10 years ago, Twitch got acquired by Amazon for close to $1 billion, and we made all this money on it. And it was really unsettling to me because I'd forgotten I was a shareholder in Twitch. And so...
By the way, Mike just did like an all-in style podcast where he just flexed how amazing he is as an investor right off the top. So that is so good.
Yeah, I guess if you call it forward fumble amazing, then it's pretty amazing. But so I'd forgotten I was a shareholder in Twitch because they had been Justin TV. They morphed into two companies, and Social Cam got bought by Autodesk, and I just thought, okay, that's the company. So I had to go to my LPs and explain to them that there was a company that we just made a bunch of money on. That do I need to restate my financials? What should I do? And they said, don't worry about it. Just send us the money. We're good. And so I noticed at this time, I'd been doing the business for about 10 years. Over 80% of my exit profits had come from pivots. And a lot of the companies, here is the other thing that was unsettling. There were a lot of companies I was working with that did all the right things. They did the business model canvas. They did customer development. They would have been a case study in what to do, except for the fact that it didn't work. And so I'm like, what's going on here? And should I Nassim Taleb has this term in Fooled by Randomness, the lucky fool. Am I just a lucky fool? And should I retire before I get exposed? And so I kind of went down this rabbit hole of discovery for a couple of years, trying to kind of push for the real about why do some of these startups have these breakthrough results, and is it all random, or maybe there is some randomness, but maybe it's not totally accidental either. And so that was, as I started to put these ideas together, I would share them with founders, and founders would say they would instantly connect with a lot of the ideas, and they're like, you should write some of these thoughts down and share them more broadly. And so that's kind of became the genesis of the book.
I want to dig into the book, and you have various things that you look for in what can be a pattern breaker. I want to get to them in just a second, but sure. I am curious, right? Like, when you build these, sometimes when I think about how people build these frameworks, they happen retroactively, where you're like, oh, I can see this pattern over time. After Twitch, in the last, Twitch happened almost like a decade ago now, I guess. But in the last 7-8 years, was there a company or a moment where you're like, aha, my model predicts this, right? Like, and I know I am onto something.
I wouldn't give myself enough credit to say that it predicts it, but I think that some of my ideas definitely improve the odds. One of the challenges with a breakthrough is you got to be non-consensus and right. And in the beginning, you don't know for a fact that you're right. You only know that you're non-consensus. And so part of I think entrepreneurship is pursuing the types of opportunities where the odds are kind of stacked in your favor. And just because you're not certain about how the dots will forward connect doesn't mean that it's not a good opportunity to pursue. I'd say that's the high order bit that I learned, is that like if 80% of my exit profits come from pivots, in the success case, it's 80% likely to change from the product I'm investing in. So what am I investing in, right? And what's the founder investing their time in? And so that's what I got really interested in understanding. And even if you have better answers and ask better questions about that, it's still hard. There's still randomness. It's still very uncertain. But we're interested in fighting. We want to wage an optimistic war on the present, and we don't want to fight fair. And we want to understand what are the weapons that we can use so that we don't have to fight fair.
Mike, I think, is one of the top coiners of phrases in the Valley. And the optimistic war on the present. I love that.
Mike, I think sort of a continuation of what you just said, right? I think one time you had mentioned how you basically have the spreadsheet of all the seed companies that had done really, really, really well, like at seed stage, and from there on, missed opportunities once you had invested, all of that. One, it's amazing that you track it, and you track it in a religious way. I love that. I just, as like a data nerd, I just love, the fact that you just track the whole thing. But what do you see as like patterns, anti-patterns, or is there no such thing? Or is it like a bit like the end of, this movie Burn After Reading, where it's like, what have we learned from this? Nothing at all. And it's just sort of like chaotic. What is the lesson there?
So first of all, how do we go about this? So I got intrigued by the fact that Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger used to read the annual reports of every company, and they'd spend 5 hours a day reading. And what you realize is that part of why they're good investors is they have a temperament advantage, right? So like in a day-by-day basis, you can't justify reading every Fortune 500 annual report because there's not a specific investment tied to that activity. But if you read that many reports over time, you have a giant lattice of mental models about what greatness looks like and what mediocrity looks like. And so I thought, well, why don't I do the same thing with startups? And so I started to create a database of startups where you would have made more than 100x on your first check. And I was like, okay, what if I decided, just like Buffett and Munger are kind of like these train spotters when it comes to understanding Fortune 500 companies, I want to be a train spotter about understanding greatness in startups, right? Like I want to understand it better than anybody in human history has ever understood it, right? And so I would study these companies. But to answer your question, Aarthi, I would say that the high order bit is there are two types of capitalism. The kind of capitalism most people think about is like normal corporate capitalism, Fortune 500 companies. And those companies are trying to create moats, and they're trying to leverage their competitive advantages, and they're trying to do all the stuff that you learn in business school that you're supposed to do. Michael Porter, 5 Forces, all that stuff. And when you bet on one of those companies, or when you run one of those companies, you're betting on its ability to persistently compound longer and more intensely than most people think it will. And I realized that startups don't do that at all. Like the startups don't have a moat, right? They don't have anything. All they have is the founders and their ideas. And so what I realized is a startup capitalist is a different kind of capitalist. Like a startup doesn't create value by persistently compounding. They create value by changing the subject. So they show up out of left field with something radically different. They can't be reconciled with anything that's ever come before. The problem with a lot of startup frameworks is they study failed startups and then they say, why did they fail? They failed because there wasn't market demand. They failed because the founders didn't get along. They failed because of X, Y, and Z. But why do startups succeed? Why do they have outlier results? They succeed when they do something radically different that changes, that breaks the mold of what's currently believed to be the way things are done and imposes instead an entirely different model. I'd say that that's the high order bit of what I've learned. And that's counterintuitive because like a lot of people would say, the way you should do a startup, probably a lot of your listeners have heard this, right? They'll say, you should go find a big market, go find customers with needs that are unserved in that market and serve their unserved needs. And that makes sense on the surface, but the problem is it buys into a context. It buys into the fact that the rules have been defined by the rules of the incumbents. We're not interested in competing according to those rules, right? We want to create a new set of unfair rules that are biased to our advantage, right? And we can't do that if that's how we go about it.
You know, when you framed it that way, like this light bulb went off in my head. Like a lot of things, these are things where I'd been thinking about. Yeah, I'd worked at really big companies like Microsoft, and then I worked at my own startups and other startups, and it's completely different, right? Like what is success for each of these is so different. And I've tried very hard to sort of articulate what that would look like. And I think for me, what I see when I talk to other founders is I look for that feeling of discomfort when a founder pitches or when they talk to me, where I'm like, I don't get it. It doesn't quite make sense, or
Rubs you the wrong way. Yeah.
Whereas if it is like a big company, it has to sort of fit into
Yes.
what would the EBITDA growth come from, and where would revenue or bookings come from? Like it's a very sort of like structured problem where you're trying to like compound the business. But if you're going to look at that and say, I don't really understand what you're doing, that is a huge problem for that company.
I was talking to Herb Allen, who runs Allen & Company, and I was asking him, what does he find common across some of the great founders they work with? And he told me something which I'll never forget. He said, the conversations when you meet a great founder are never smooth. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, well, you often have these conversations in life where it's just smooth. You know what the other person is going to say. And there's really no sharp edges. But almost in every case, for him empirically, when you meet a fantastic founder, there are sharp, jagged edges. And what that means is they might make a provocative statement. They might make a prediction, which makes you go like, wait, how is that possible? Or they might have crazy amount of belief in themselves. And just something where he's like, the conversation isn't smooth, which was just like a great, once I heard that, I kind of back tested it on all the conversations. That kind of makes sense.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Because a breakthrough startup is a fundamentally disagreeable act, right? It's an act of rebellion against the present. So like the way I like to look at it is there are two ways of looking at the future. One way to look at the future is the way most people do, which is to forecast. You project forward from what's known. You project forward from what's happening. You assume that the pattern will persist and that the future is going to be a new and improved version of the present. And that's how most people show up in the world. Another way to look at the future is to say, if I'm a startup capitalist, I don't like those futures. I can only win if the future is going to be radically different by definition. And so I have to start with the premise that it's only worth pursuing futures that are radically different. And then I work backwards from those radically different futures. I backcast and don't forecast. And so like the reason that I want to do that is that if the future is a forward projection of the present, the rules of the present still apply. Those rules have already been defined by somebody else. And so what I want to do instead is show up in a radically different future. And then I have to find early believers in that different future, and I need to pull them with me as co-conspirators, right, to that future of my design. And that's how these companies achieve breakthroughs. And eventually, the world adopts their point of view around the future. In order to do that, you have to be radically different, right? You have to force a choice and not a comparison, right? Startups lose if they can be compared to other things. So like my favorite recent example is the Cybertruck. When I first saw the Cybertruck demonstrated, and then they throw that rock against the window and it breaks the window, it's just a disaster demo. At first, I thought maybe this is a joke. Is he really going to ship a truck that looks like that? I'm still not 100% convinced I'm going to get that Cyber Beast. But I'll tell you one thing, you could think that the Cybertruck is ridiculous, but nobody after seeing the Cybertruck says, how does that compare to an F-150? It forces you to choose either believe Elon's future or don't. Live in that future with him or don't. occupy that future or don't. The original Tesla Roadster would not have survived a comparison in a normal way, right? A Porsche has nicer seats, it's got a better radio, it's got more luxury appointments, but like that's not the basis of comparison. People bought the Tesla not for practical reasons, but for aesthetic reasons. They believed in Elon's aesthetically different future. And so that's what I also found about these startups was that their early customers were animated by belief, not practicality. And they wanted to co-create the future with the founders, and they had an intense desire to self-actualize by co-conspiring with the founders to engage in this optimistic warfare against the present. They wanted to be part of the rebellion with the founders.
Now, in your book, you talk about inflections, insights, and founder future fit. Could you maybe walk us through what each of those mean?
Yes. I started to think about, okay, we know what the powers are that big companies have. Economies of scale, network effects, brand, process power, supply chains, all that stuff. What powers does a startup have to change the subject? The first power is inflections. And an inflection is an external change event that creates the potential for radical change. And so we partnered with you guys on Lyft, right? And which is a good example. So the inflection that enabled Lyft was that the iPhone 4S had a GPS locator chip embedded in it. The reason that matters is that we need to have some form of weapon to bend the arc of the present to a radically different future. So the inflection is like the rock in David's slingshot against Goliath. It's the thing that gives them the power, which when properly harnessed, allows them to show up in a radically different and disorienting way that utterly changes the rules and allows them to ship a product that can't be reconciled with anything before. But the inflection's only the first part. The next part of it is the insight, which is where the creativity of the founder comes in. So like inflections are all around us all the time and often go unexploited. You know, like the wheel initially was mounted horizontally to make pots. Mm-hmm. And it took several hundred years before somebody had the notion to mount it vertically and to move wagons. So just because you have a power doesn't mean that you use it. And so what the founders do is they connect the dots. They say, oh, I can harness this new power in a new way that's going to create value for somebody. And so that's where the insight is a non-obvious truth about how these inflections can be harnessed to create a radical breakthrough product. So the insight behind Lyft was, oh, that means you could do Airbnb for cars. So now all of a sudden, because I can locate riders and drivers algorithmically, I can treat them the same way that Airbnb treats hosts and guests. And so they had to come up with that idea, just like, you know, the DoorDash guys had to come up with the idea for restaurant delivery that also leveraged GPS location, or Instacart had to do for grocery delivery, so that they had to have the creative breakthrough idea. The other part of the insight that I learned is it needs to be non-consensus. Mm-hmm. And the reason is that if it's consensus, it's not different enough, right? So like human beings are conditioned to like things. So if everybody likes your startup idea, it's too similar to what they already like, which means it's not different enough. And so the best ideas, like the reason that the Cybertruck's a good example is not everybody's going to like the Cybertruck, but that's okay. You want a situation where perhaps even most people will dislike it, but some subset of people say, oh my gosh, I've seen the light. Where have you been all my life? This is amazing. I can't unsee it. And so
like that is Aarthi, by the way. She saw one recently and she was like, this is what I'm going to
do. And I think when we move back to San Francisco, we're getting it.
Oh yeah, I think it's totally badass, right? Like I think it's an urban assault vehicle, just awesome. Like I just think the fact that it exists in this world is amazing, right? Like I can't believe he had the guts to actually deliver that as a product. It's just awesome. And so then, you know, we also mentioned founder future fit. The question that always comes after, okay, insights, I could see why that's valuable. Where do insights come from? How do I get them? And what I learned is that that it's counterintuitive, but the best way to come up with a great startup insight is not to try to think of a startup. Because if you try to think of a startup, you'll orient your thinking in the world of the present, and you'll try to solve present pain for present-facing people. So what I learned is that insights come from living in the future. And the poster child of this would be your fearless leader, Mark Andreessen, right? So, Mark was a student at the University of Illinois making minimum wage at a supercomputer lab. The internet had only been recently made legal for business at all to use. And he's tinkering with these new technologies of the World Wide Web. Did he know about a browser market? No. I mean, Mark didn't really even know anything about business at the time. He had his resume on the front page of Netscape, but that's about it. But like what Mark was doing was he was building what was missing in the future. And so great insights come from living in the future, and they come from the future for two reasons. One is by living in the future and tinkering with cutting edge technologies, you yourself experience firsthand the pattern breaking new opportunities afforded to you by that technology. And you understand what the limits are and what the barriers are to getting full use out of it. And it's that thought process that causes you to identify what's missing. And when you build what's missing in the future, your intuition about what to build is far more likely to be right. And so I like startup ideas where the founder is living in a valid future that a bunch of us are about to live in. In the case of Mark, he solved his own problem. In the case of another company we worked on together, Okta, Todd McKinnon and Freddie Karrast knew all the early adopters of the cloud because they were at Salesforce. And so they knew who the lighthouse customers were. When I was at Silicon Graphics, I used to sell computers to Industrial Light and Magic to do effects for like Terminator 2 and The Abyss and Jurassic Park. And I realized as I was working with them, if we solve their problem, they're just going to lead us to the promised land. All of the problems they're solving, everybody's going to want to solve in Hollywood someday. And so if we can help them build what's missing in the future that they're designing, everybody's going to want to use SGI equipment for making movies. And, it's just a matter of time. And so that's what I mean by living in the future. And then the other part of it that I think is interesting has to do with authenticity. So like Todd McKinnon was a very authentic founder for solving identity management for cloud customers because he'd already solved their problem at Salesforce. You're not going to have Justin Kahn when he's a year out of Yale start that company. Nobody's going to trust him. But like conversely, Justin Kahn wanted to be an influencer before there was a word to describe influencers, right? He had Justin TV streaming his life 24/7. You'd never do that if you had kids. You'd never do that if you had a life that was anywhere semblance of normal. And so part of founder future fit is you ask yourself the question, is this the ideally suited person or set of people to pursue this future?
Yeah.
Sir Eunice at Applied Intuition, he's looking across the table from a guy, he's going to ask him for hundreds of millions of dollars. Like that person, that CEO of that car company has to look across the table at you and say, that guy could do the job. That team could do the job, right? And so you've got to have a certain set of talents that nobody else has to pull.
I think there's something about, when you talk about founder future fit, there's also something about putting yourself in the right spot to make that future happen. When I was reading a book, I was preparing for this yesterday, and I was pattern matching it to maybe some of the most interesting companies around in AI, OpenAI and Anthropic. And if you look at the OpenAI story, of course, there are many, many versions. So there's a little bit of like Rashomon going on. But the version of the story, which I think is most common, is you have a bunch of people who really believe in AGI, and they come together with Sam and Elon and others to be like, let's go try and work on AGI together. Now, the interesting part here is they do not have a breakthrough. They don't actually have a technical advance. So they actually haven't seen an inflection point, I would argue, or they haven't, because that is yet to happen. But when a few years later, and they're off, building these Dota bots, and OpenAI is kind of, doing a bunch of like robotics and a bunch of others. But a few years go by, and when Google, with Noam Shazia and all these folks, write the attention paper, they are now OpenAI. These folks are now primed and ready to make said future happen. So I was thinking about how it is not exactly the same as you wait and see an inflection point, but in a way they lived in the future, and that puts them in the right position to go make the future happen and make the inflection point happen.
Yeah, and OpenAI is an interesting edge case, as are some of these large model companies, I think. Because like one way I think about them is, are they really startups in the sense of how the three of us would think of startups? Like when I think of a startup, I think of 0 to 1, bootstrap something, try a few experiments, and then iterate from there. You could argue that a lot of these big LLM model companies are really someday future divisions of big tech companies. And that what they really are doing is sustaining innovations, and they're getting funded at levels that normal large corporations will get funded at. They're acting like a small version of a big company rather than a startup. That's open for debate, right? But I think that what's interesting to me about AI is I see inflections all over the place. I see, the latest LLM, and I see it having incredible empowerment. I see products that embody these inflections, and I'm like, I can see why people would use them. I use them. But the thing that's often lacking, I find, in these AI startups is insights. I don't see very many AI startups where I'm like, oh, wow, that person has a non-consensus and right idea about what's possible in the future. What they have is a consensus way that's going to be very compelling to empower people, but there's going to be 10 others just like it. Or, it's going to get leapfrogged when Sam Altman does his next demo of the next version of LLM, right? And so that's the challenge I've seen in AI. Like we mentioned Kasser Eunice and Applied Intuition a little bit ago. One of the things that I found appealing about that company was I thought you're going to need to be able to solve a very specific, important set of problems for the car companies that a general model will never solve. And so you could assemble a team and have some insights about what that product needs to be that would not be easy to copy, and it'd be hard for other people to assemble a similar offering to that. A lot of these ideas, I'm like, I don't see how that's defensible. I don't know why there's a structural competitive advantage to this.
Yeah. So I guess with that, do you see AI? I was going to ask you, is AI in your viewpoint? Is it a real inflection point? Is it not really an inflection point? Does it depend on which cohort of companies and what kind of applications?
Yeah, and this is something maybe we should have a jam session on someday, but I think it's even more than an inflection. I think it's a sea change, right? Like, so I've seen two of them in my career so far. Like when I was a kid, the IBM PC came out, and I now call that sea change mass computation. And what happened was compute became commoditized. Moore's law was a thing. The interesting thought experiment became, what do you do in a world where computation becomes near zero cost in the future? What ended up happening was you had a shifting of power from hardware to software vendors for the most part, right? And you started to say, I'm not going to price based on the data center. I'm going to try to get a desktop in every house and every desktop, right? Then you have this era of mass connectivity. That was, I think, that it embodies both the internet and the smartphone. And rather than a computer on every desk in every home and have microprocessors become free, you want to connect everybody in the world, and communication bandwidth becomes free. The thing that becomes scarce is attention, and being the system of record and capturing the critical data about these networks. That's the era that I think we're exiting. And I think that the new era is mass cognition. What are cognitive behaviors and activities that are currently expensive that will become asymptotically free? That's the thought experiment I like to run, right? And so, in a world where that happens, how does power shift, right? So, for example, you might say that lawyers are very smart, but they engage in a set of cognitive tasks where the knowledge is already discovered. And there's other types of smart people who create knowledge that is undiscovered. I would argue that the value, relatively speaking, of undiscovered knowledge relative to discovered knowledge is going to go up, because discovered knowledge now can be ingested in an LLM and can be understood by anybody in the world. And it could even be understood as the system of record of what the truth is for the discovered knowledge. So, it's kind of like, just like the value of software became relatively more important in mass computation, and the value of network nodes became relatively more value in the mass connectivity. I'm just super intrigued by cognition becoming commoditized in certain fields. And where might cognition be bundled? Where might it be unbundled? How does it relate to new knowledge versus existing knowledge? How does that change power and shift the dynamics? And so where do incumbents play a role? Where do startups play a role? All those things, I think, are super fun questions.
One question for you on the inflection point, because I think a lot of people internalize some of your writing over the years, or, for example, read the YouTube memo which talks about, hey, what happens when everyone has a digital camera, in their pockets, and what is kind of the inflection curve which happens there. On the other hand, I often think about people can often sometimes talk themselves into inflections which are not real. For example, in the mid 2000s, you had this whole range of climate tech, which never really wound up happening. There have been I would say, other technology trends where either, for many reasons, either there was the regulation or the technology didn't pan out, it just didn't work out. So I guess, how do you actually know, I guess this is a whole ball game. How do you actually know the inflection you're thinking about is a real inflection, as opposed to something which is a blip or doesn't really actually work out maybe the way you're hoping it would?
Yeah, and I think I love that question because and it relates to another really important topic, I think, which is, I think timing is just the hardest thing to figure out in all this, right? Like, if you were going to say to me, what risk is the most important risk, the hardest one to get right, I might assert that timing is the hardest one by maybe even a wide margin in my experience, right? Because a lot of the other risks they create risk, but they can be managed more with more intention. So like what I tried to do, and not to over promote the book, but what we tried to talk about in the book was this idea of stress testing, right? So I would say to a founder, okay, we think that the iPhone 4S GPS chip is an inflection.
Right.
Okay. So the first question is just, what is the specific new thing introduced? Because like what a lot of people do is they conflate a trend with an inflection. They'll say the number of megapixels per dollar is improving in phone cameras. Mm-hmm. And what I say to people is, that's not an inflection. That's an improvement trajectory. But there has to be a moment in time, a moment of specific new empowerment that never existed before, right? So like you could have been right about ride sharing before the iPhone 4S, but it wouldn't have mattered because you couldn't have built a system that embodied your vision for the future, or you couldn't have delivered the value that you proposed to deliver. But now all of a sudden, with the iPhone 4S, for the first time ever, today is different than yesterday. Today means I can now deliver a system that would locate riders and drivers in real time. So then the second part of the inflection is, what is the specific empowerment and who does it empower? Yeah. And so like in the case of the iPhone 4S, the empowerment was, you can locate anybody with a smartphone using an algorithm within 1 meter accuracy. And who does it empower? Well, we think it's going to empower a lot of people because a lot of people are going to have smartphones with these chips in them. Mm-hmm. And then the third question that we ask is, what are the empowerment conditions? Because, I mean, you kind of pointed this out, Sriram, like a good example would be nuclear power. We've been able to do nuclear power plants since the 70s, since before even, but we haven't built any new ones in 50 years, right? And so just because you have a form of empowerment doesn't mean the empowerment conditions will be met. So, like, for example, what happens if people don't want to share their location information apps? What happens if the government outlaws GPS chips? What happens if Apple quits shipping phones with these chips? I felt like it was unlikely. Like, I felt like it was pretty safe to assume that those three questions are going to go our way on that inflection. But like what I like to say to the founder is, the more specific you are, the more likely you are to have an inflection where the odds play to your favor, right? We can never comprehensively or conclusively or absolutely say, yes, this is the inflection, but we can stress test it, right? We can ask ourselves, what is the magnitude of the empowerment and who's it empower?
Yeah, I've been wanting to talk to you about this for a while. On maybe a slight change in topic, and I love following you on X, and we are in various groups of people together, and we talk about inflections and changes. I would say there's been a vibe shift in Silicon Valley when it comes to politics and free speech in the last few years, and I have seen you as one of the people who talk, who kind of been vocal about some of these vibe shifts, whether it be Elon on X, whether it be like various regulatory postures. As somebody who's kind of been seeing Silicon Valley for a while, how do you perceive the moment we are in? It seems to be one where, if I think about like 14 years ago, I don't remember these topics to be top of mind. A typical Elon-like founder would not be in doing what he does today. How do you see the current moment in time in terms of the vibes?
Silicon Valley and politics are kind of interesting. Like when I was at Stanford in the 80s, one of the kind of popular voices was this guy named T.J. Rogers, and he was very libertarian. And I would say that the Silicon Valley types that I knew were a little bit more like that than they were what you currently see. And then Clinton won for president. Clinton had a pretty assertive and determined charm offensive, right, with Silicon Valley, and he did a good job, right? He did a good job of he understood the issues, and his instincts were very good on the internet, right? His instincts were not to regulate it too quickly, were not to. He's like, hey, let's let this play out and see what happens. And so I think that most of Silicon Valley, I find, tends to kind of go with the flow. Like most of Silicon Valley kind of doesn't really want to upset the apple cart, isn't really that political, just wants to kind of do their job. And if being slightly left of center keeps me out of trouble, why not? But like, I don't think that most people think about it that much, to be honest. The trend has been towards blue, right? What's bothered me about Silicon Valley, people should believe what they want to believe, but I always get nervous whenever I see a monoculture or when there's a monopoly on something, right? So there's a book that was written about 50 years ago called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And when you're in a society, you can decide to be loyal. You can say, hey, I'm a patriot, or I'm a Democrat, or I'm a Republican, I'm a whatever. I'm pro Tesla. And just whatever that society does, you just say, I'm on board with it. Or you come up with reasons to justify it. So that's loyalty. Voice is, I want to stay here, but I got some opinions about this, right? Like kind of how I am with California. I'm like, where's that damn super train that we paid billions of dollars for? Let's get crack-a-lackin'. Are we going to learn how to build stuff or not, California? But like, I'm not necessarily leaving, but then the other option is to leave. And exit is what gives voice its power. So like the reason that X matters so much, you don't have to agree with everything that's on X. The reason that X matters is it's an alternative. And what we need in a dynamic society is choice among competing alternatives. That's the problem that a lot of these big tech companies have, is everybody has the same political sensibilities. So you end up with an intellectual monoculture. And I don't think, and the same thing happens in the New York Times and a bunch of our institutions. And the problem with that is not that they come by their views dishonestly. The problem is that the other perspective just never shows up. When the New York Times writes an article about Trump's tax plan, they call it his tax scheme because, they've got like a bunch of people in the room who don't like Donald Trump writing the story. So there's no intellectual diversity in challenging or confirming these ideas. And so that's why I think X is so important. By the way, that's why the University of Austin is so important, right, in the university system. And so the fact that alternatives exist at all is a good thing, and because that's what holds the existing primary institutions accountable. When they're not held accountable, they act like monopolies, and they become more interested in preserving their own power than in fulfilling their mission. That's what I think is profound about X.
Yeah, I think you made a bunch of very interesting points. And I would say for a lot of people, some people who may be listening to this, they might assume what you said is code for being on the right or being Republican. I don't think it's true. It's actually about having multiple points of view. I want to make a couple of points.
There's a lot of stuff the right does that I don't like. I think that they're wrong on abortion and a bunch of things, right? So, yeah.
So I would take a couple of things. One is I wrote this post tweet the other day, and somebody pointed out Paul Graham had a great post called Accidental Moderates. I'm always very disappointed when I meet somebody and when they express one opinion, could be any topic, any policy, and with that, I can predict every other opinion they have. Because what it tells me immediately is that it's very rare that you absolutely have the exact same opinion as the tribe, who believes in one thing. And I'm always like, okay, then I'm not terribly sure you're thinking for yourself. And even when I don't disagree with somebody, if I see them having differing opinions, right? Like, I'm like, this person is kind of interesting, right? Like, for example, if you believe in very, very strong AI regulation and you are a very hardcore, Republican and Texan, I'm like, okay, well, that is interesting because that is not what I usually expect in convergence. I want to know, I want to learn about you a little bit more. That's one. The other part is I would add some nuance to your point about what happened inside the big tech companies, because when I think it's died down a little, and Elon has taken some credit for it. But in the 2020, 2021, when you see all these activism happening inside big tech, it was almost always the act of a small minority. And I would talk to so many people, these VPs or directors, and their whole thing was, I don't agree, but I don't want to get into this fight, right? I don't want to be on the Slack threads. I don't want to, get into some side conversation where I would debate. Those people have way too much free time. I'm just going to put my head down and going to do the thing that I was supposed to. And I think so there is always a silent majority which often doesn't get heard in any direction, on any topic. But it's a very small minority which is very, very vocal.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I do think that there is, whenever I would talk to people in Silicon Valley, like when Trump won the election, when I would talk to people in Silicon Valley, they'd say, boy, I really need to get out to those red states and understand why people voted for Trump. But they would almost talk about people in the red states like they were observing a zoo animal in their natural habitat or something, right? Like it didn't occur to them that some people had legitimate reasons to vote for Trump, perhaps. And that the fact that they didn't think that there was a single reason other than people are racist or stupid or whatever, maybe that reflects their own lack of curiosity about what some of these issues are. But when you marinate in an echo chamber where everyone has the same ideas and repeats the same talking points, call this book Pattern Breakers, you don't realize that the core assumptions of your being and your thought process are conforming to a set of patterns that are very embedded and unquestioned. So like that's the problem I've seen some in Silicon Valley. I do see more alternative thoughts now that are in the Overton window of what's reasonable to talk about. But I still think that we could benefit from some more intellectual diversity, regardless of what side of the issues you're on.
Your point, I think, Sriram and I, we immigrated to the US in 2007. And 2016, that election was the first ever time as US citizens we were able to vote. And in our minds, it's been almost a decade of living here. We sort of thought we knew what America was about. We knew the people. We had this mental model. And I remember waking up the day after the election results came out and telling Sriram, I think our entire worldview on how our mental model of America is completely broken. And I'm just disappointed that we never actually paid attention and, actually were curious about this. We've always been proud of our ability to be curious and sort of be contra, going against the tide of our peer groups and that kind of thing. And we sort of I felt like we totally failed because we completely didn't understand this huge cohort of this population of this country that we'd moved to, and it's now our home. And we were we have to do better to at least understand what is going on there. And I think for a lot of people, that was sort of this wake up call where you can say whatever you want about those people. There's always going to be this cohort of people who are not like you and who don't fit into your worldview, but it is your job and your responsibility to go understand them. And whether it is politics or whether it is any other field, it is your job to be able to go do that and at least have a mental model of what's going on there.
Yeah, and it's wild to me, right? So my wife has a lot of relatives in Florida. And so when I'm in California, people, the typical discussion is something to the effect of, well, it almost doesn't matter who we elect as long as it's not Trump because he's a terrible guy and he's a threat to democracy and, he's an odious orange man. He's terrible, right? That's kind of what I normally hear. When I go to Florida, they're like, well, clearly the press just hates Trump and, these people in California are just crazy and they just believe a bunch of crazy nonsense about social issues and they got bums living in all their cities and crime everywhere. And it's you just realize that the people are just they're just exposed to the thoughts that they're exposed to within their tribe, and they don't even question their thoughts, right? There's no, I have no idea if Trump is a threat to democracy or not. My instinct is probably not, could be wrong, but everybody has a story that they believe that plays in their mind like a movie, and they're convinced is objective, right? But really it's just a story, and everybody's got their own story.
I'll give you one example before, to wrap this topic. I find myself defending one particular company, and I have a bunch of friends who are on the left, a bunch of friends who are on the right, and that company is Meta and Mark Zuckerberg. And it's hilarious because to my friends maybe a lot of my friends on the left, they are like, well, look at Zuck. He's gone full UFC, Rogan, MMA right-wing character. He's supporting Trump, and they kind of see him as a proxy for capitalism, tech broism, whatever you want to call it, and somebody on the right. When I talk to some of my friends on the right, they look at Zuck and they're like, well, this is a company which has a large middle management PMC class. They're out there censoring thought and speech on the left. So I was talking to a very senior meta person being like, you folks just get it from both sides, right? And maybe that's a good spot to be, but it tells you so much about like the narrative powers that can just build up.
Oh, yeah. And, I've seen him testify some of these times at Congress, and they're blaming him for stuff. I'm surprised he doesn't say, well, if you don't like that, why don't you change the law? Like, your job is to change you're Congress, right? Congress passes laws. If you read the Constitution, I'm following the law. You don't like the fact that I'm following the law. Just tell me what the rules are so I can follow them. And it's like, but it ends up being this circus because people want to get their soundbite on TV for their election campaign rather than really seek the truth about what the issue really is or what should happen.
This is going to be a really big pivot, but I know you're fond of pivots. I wanted to ask you about being a fund manager. You've done some really great content around this, and it's just been excellent, right? And every time I talk to a solo GP or a fund manager, especially around portfolio construction, how do you think about it? It's always like, oh, Mike Maples Jr. Like, just, look at what he has to say. You're like sort of this person. And even when we moved to Silicon Valley and I started companies, I think you'd sort of like were the origin story of like seed funding and that very early stage side of things. So if you were, what advice do you have for somebody who's starting a new fund or is being a fund manager?
Yeah, so there's a few things. Maybe we'll start with fundraising, because like without money, you can't really do much of the rest of it. And so the first piece of advice I give to fund managers is don't think of fundraising as a sales cycle. And so what a lot of people do is they say, there's a bunch of people out there with money. I need to get their money so that they can invest in my fund. And if they have objections, I need to anticipate and counter those objections so that they'll invest. And so I used to say to people, and I applied this in my own fundraising, I always assumed that when I was fundraising, there's already a set of people who know they want to invest. And I wasn't going to try to convince any new people to invest. I was only going to go to the people I thought already wanted to invest and say, I'm fundraising right now. Are you interested? And so all new LP relationships I formed were never under the pressure of fundraising. I would meet with them. The first thing I'd say is, I'm not fundraising. I'm not asking you for money. There's nothing up my sleeve. I've just heard that, you're good people, and I'd love to learn more about how you work with venture firms. Why is that important? Well, when you're an early fund, you want investors who believe what you believe. And so you don't want to be in a mindset of trying to counter their objections and persuade them to do something they don't want to do. You're much better off saying, here's honestly my strategy. And, you either believe or you don't believe. If you don't believe, I want to know why. Not to prove you wrong, but because I might learn something. You might be right. You might have input about my strategy that makes my strategy better. If their input about the strategy I think is wrong, then it's a good thing they're not investing, because I don't want investors who don't value what I value, right? And so that was the first thing I learned. And then the second thing is related is your fund size is your strategy, because power law is real, and your biggest exit is going to be more than half of your fund's profits. And so therefore, if you want a 5X fund, your biggest exit has to return 2.5X the fund by itself. And so therefore, you're making a commitment to LPs about your biggest anticipated exit size as a function of your fund size. So that, I'd say that's the second thing. There's a whole lot of other stuff too. I encourage people to have more upfront and less in reserves, 70% upfront, 30% reserves. But all of these things, and maybe the reason I get quoted about it somewhat is I've had the time to think through the first principles basis, right, for why that is. I can show you mathematically why you want more upfront and less in reserve, and not just tribal knowledge and, anecdotal wisdom kind of stuff. I'd say those are the main things. And then the other thing that I encourage people to do is over time, try to figure out your circle of competency. And so try to figure out where you have an advantage and where you have one, and try to do as many of your investments in that zone as you can. And if you're finding opportunities outside of your zone, you can expand your zone, but you should be very mindful of when you're expanding it. So one of the ways I think of my circle of competency is it's an existence proof. And so when I look at a new startup, I'm like, have I ever invested in a startup that looks like this ever in 20 years and made money doing this? And if the answer is no, I'm like, that doesn't mean I shouldn't do it, but it means I should be thoughtful about the reasons why.
Yeah, this is great. Sriram and I, we have this WhatsApp chat, right? We're just going back and forth. This is excellent. This is amazing. We love this sort of content. You are definitely, this is when we do a podcast episode, when we record it, we know when it works. It's because you are our people. And we know that this is what our audience also it kind of resonates with and it clicks. So I'm just very excited for this to go live. Maybe one last question. And this is, floodgate for me. When I first started out, I think I came to your office and I was very sort of like intimidated, very smitten. This was the place where people...
Oh, you got to fix that.
We went for like seed rounds and everybody, all my founder batch, like the cohort of people, everybody who moved to Silicon Valley were like, oh, floodgate, that's where you should go. That's the first place you should like knock on. And so for me, it was like...
after you go to Andreessen Horowitz, by the way, is what they actually probably said. But okay, let's just keep going.
16D has made a big push in seed in recent years. As I understand it.
And for me, it was like this quasi-religious experience. I'm just one of those people. So I think for me, a lot of our listeners are founders or people who want to be founders. What advice do you have for them, especially for somebody who's thinking of starting a company, could be relevant in this new age of like AI and this sort of like sea change, or not, you're just a founder or aspiring founder. What advice do you have for somebody like that?
There's a couple things. The first thing I would say is that not all opportunities are equal. Really, the only way to fail, in my worldview, is to pursue an opportunity where a few years in, you wish you had. The only way you can really fail is to lose your time. So I don't mind pursuing something that's incredibly risky and we fail quickly. That doesn't bother me too much because we took a valid, earnest try at changing the pattern of the future. But what happens in too many cases is the founder will be 2 years in, 3 years in, and now they're pursuing the idea out of obligation rather than passion. They've got employees, they've got investors, they've made all these commitments, but knowing what they know now, they wouldn't have done it. And so like what I tried to do, and this is part of why I wrote the book, is that these founders are kind of my peeps, right? And I wanted them to have better ways of assessing, is this opportunity, is it a plausibly good sounding idea that's not good, that's going to get me stuck in where I'm going to have a slog? Avoid those, right? But then I also wanted to find ways to protect the ideas that sound dumb, but might be kind of good or might be worth pursuing. Justin TV was a terrible idea, but it was a great opportunity because it had a set of powers, forces underneath it that allowed them to pivot to something great. So I'd say that's the number one thing, is that stress testing your ideas, it matters, right? And it's like, the only thing you'll never get back is your time. Pursue things worthy of your talent and time. And then the other thing, I don't know if it's advice, but it's, God bless you for trying, right? Like, we need people who are going to change the future, right? Like, founders have the guts to stick their neck out and against all odds and against all the naysayers, they change the future and they drag us along with them, sometimes against our will, but for the goodness of humanity in the fullness of time. And it's a hard business. Great ideas at first, everybody thinks it's stupid. People thought Twitter was stupid. People thought Airbnb wasn't going to work. People thought nobody's going to get in a stranger's car. And so you go through this early innings where people think your idea is dumb. People dislike it. People rubs them the wrong way. Don't buy into the conventional dogma. The conventional people don't get to decide what the future is. You get to decide what the future is. Just because you're non-consensus doesn't mean you're right, but it doesn't mean you're wrong. Have the courage of your convictions to tune out the naysayers. They don't count.
Mike, I can't think of a better way to end this. I'll just say you are an OG. You've done so much for this industry and ecosystem. This conversation was a privilege, but it's also been a greater privilege to kind of just work with you and watch you operate. So for those of you listening, go buy the book. The book is Pattern Breakers, right? Obviously, Mike doesn't need money, given he just listed all the amazing investments he has made. But we want to get the word out there, and also I would highly recommend Everyone follow him on X. He's a fantastic follow and always an original thinker. Mike, thank you so much for coming on. This was so fun.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor, and it was fun to spend this time. It's like it's a shame that we have to use a podcast as a reason to spend more time together. But hey, I'll take any excuse I can get.
And we're hanging out on this sort of a platform. We did this once on Clubhouse with Annie Duke, and you were there on that. So we'll just have to keep finding more opportunities to just do these.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a blast. Thank you.
Thanks. Great seeing you.